Ron Helmway is going to introduce our speaker. Ron?
Thank you. Before saying that, we recognized Mark Walker earlier. And, you know, you have varying degrees, but I'll tell you, 2 nights ago, my phone rang and it was Mark Walker. And he said, I just want to check him. And I said, I feel like crap, but it's the same crap that everybody's suffering from. So Mark, thanks, because you're really looking after everybody, the serious ones and the not so serious. And also to recognize, we paid recognition to Ronnie Rondum. There's nobody in this room whose life is more valuable than anyone else. And I love all of them. Ronnie Rondum brought me into this organization, and I love you, man. We're happy for you. By the way, not only, you know he's well, because not only is he going to Europe on a skiing vacation, he's taking a beautiful lady with him. So. Well, it's not my wife, okay? At least I don't think so. I want to introduce Lieutenant Colonel retired Kevin Keaveney. Kevin's going to speak on an air cushion vehicle operations, cavalry afloat. I thought all these air cushion vehicles were logistics. Found out from Kevin they aren't. Kevin served for 25 years in the Army, began his career as an armor officer, served all the way up to the office of Secretary of Defense, and he's written since his retirement on several books about the 173rd Airborne Brigade, things like just very interesting Catholic chaplains in Vietnam, military pigeon operations, the P-40 and the attack on the 21st Fighter Group during the Battle of Iwo Jima. I first came to know Kevin, put him to work on what we called an initiatives group, and I admired and developed a friendship and respect for him for his candor, his immense amount of intelligence, his work ethic, and he was one of the few people who was able to comprehend my rabbled, confused, elementary mind and take things that I thought of and make sense out of them. And probably the best one of those was simply telling he and a colleague, if you've ever heard of the 82nd Airborne and they've got a division ready battalion and all that, and they rotate that, I don't understand why we can't do that for the Army Reserve when we've got to keep troops there continuously. So you need to go to work on that. Kevin did that, returned it, and now today it's a formal institutionalized product of the entire Army called the Army Force Generation Model. And it's an entirely different way of doing business for the U.S. Army, but Kevin really initiated that. And I value his friendship, and I think we'll all find his presentation here very, very interesting. Kevin, thank you for joining us today.
Just to really check, can everyone hear okay with this microphone? If you cannot hear, raise your hand. Only Marines, I'm sorry. All right. Just speak into there, buddy. Good, thank you, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here to give this talk today. I never served in this unit. I ran across this unit when I was a captain, and I wanted to enter a Armor Association competition. This was back in the 1990s, on what a future tank should look like. So, of course, I tried to come up with an idea that was different than everybody else's. So I decided that to regain speed in the cavalry and armor forces over even the mechanized infantry, air cushion vehicles would be the way to go. So, being a person that wants to know the facts behind it, I went ahead and started doing research on what had happened up till this time. And I ran across this unit. Well, that was 1993. I was a senior captain getting ready to be a major. I went ahead, wrote the article, and kind of thought that was it. Well, later on, 20 years later, I'm now expanding what was the original article into a book, and hopefully, based on raising of funds, it'll turn into a documentary. It actually came up as a point when I was working in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I was always the one that had to look at history and come back with ideas. And so this actually resurfaced as I was working in OSD, referenced the current war operations. Now, let me make sure I got my technology down here. Well, and of course, I got it. Yep, it's on. First question, just so I got a feel for the audience right now. How many served in Military Region 3 or 4? Just raise your hand. Okay, so you're still in the group that might know about this unit. How many were part of the Riverine Force or 9th Infantry Division? Okay, you're getting much closer to the topic. And overall, how many are familiar with hovercraft and air cushion vehicles and how they operate? Okay. Did anybody that happened to be in Military Region 3 or 4 ever run across air cushion vehicles? Okay, so we got two people, okay? And most of the groups that I talk to, that's actually more than most. So, with that said, the 39th Cavalry Platoon. Now, it was not always known by that designation. That designation actually came in fairly late in the unit's history, in basically 1970. And the 39, from talking to the unit members, and I've interviewed probably close to 30 of them, probably a total of 100 people ever served in this unit. It was a combination of it being the fact that at that time it was assigned to 3rd Brigade of the 9th Infantry Division. So they kind of combined the numbers. For one, something they did in the field took all the way up to the Department of the Army level. So when they actually published the first approved MTO for the unit, that's the designation that the unit actually received at the time. I'm going to break this down into basically 4 areas. The first area I'm going to talk to is about the craft, the capabilities, and the crew that were on it. Now, for those that had seen a hovercraft, there actually is a little trick that we'll talk about later on. These were not the only air cushion vehicles in Vietnam. The Navy actually had 3, and there was only 3 Army vehicles, 2 a little bit before the Army unit. At first, when I did the initial research, I did not think there was a lot of connection between the 2 except for a little train over period. I have found that to be a little bit different at this stage. So I'll bring up the Navy, but this is going to actually focus onto the Army units. Basically, the SK-5s, as they were known, were licensed and modified British hovercraft. At the time, they were the most successful hovercrafts in the world. And as a matter of fact, this is based on the first model of the first production ACVs worldwide. So, as a matter of fact, the gentleman that invented the mechanism for this air cushion vehicle, that, how it worked on the British side, who later was knighted for it, he actually became a little disappointed in the British way of dealing with the designs that he had come up with. The British licensed it to the United States. We produced it, the Japanese produced some of them. So these are modified off the original British versions. They're basically 38 feet in length, 16 feet tall, carried about 304 gallons of fuel in a self-sealing fuel tank. And what you'll notice as you go through this is, and this was kind of the question of the day, people didn't know how to handle the vehicle. They didn't know if they were helicopters, they didn't know if they were tanks, they didn't know if they were reconnaissance vehicles. So this is one of those cases where the people in the field that operate them got to really define how those vehicles were. So to me, that's a good thing. when the troops actually get to define what's going to go on with the vehicle. They're about 8.5 tons in weight. Top speed was 70 miles per hour. So basically anything they had down in the Delta, other than the aircraft and the helicopters, this was the fastest thing going. And as I said, there was only 3 of them built. And the Navy, when they built theirs again, they had 3 of them. And you should recognize this name. They were built by Bell Aero Systems, or basically Bell Helicopter, the ones that did the UH-1s. So it's very common between, you'll see a lot of commonality between the UH-1s and these ACVs. And what was interesting about it in the United States was a lot of companies, because hovercraft were the thing in the late 1950s, early 1960s, everybody was trying to get their foot in the game. If you ever go back and look at the other designs that were done, it kind of goes to that old philosophy. If it looks good, it's going to run good, it's going to fly good, it's going to do what it's supposed to do. This was about the best looking one of the bunch. Most of the ones that the US actually designed themselves, when you looked at them, you kind of had that idea of it's, yeah, a lot of good thoughts, but we don't think they're going to work out. Again, this was the best one. Now, with that said, Bell, on the Army ones, actually ended up modifying them a lot based on the Navy experience. They were powered by a General Electric LM100 turboshaft engine. If you're an Air Force helicopter pilot, that engine is the same one that was basically in the CH-3s and their version of the UH-1s, not the Army ones, but on the Air Force side. So the engines are basically the same. So you had some interchange there, but not necessarily a lot. Now, the way the engine worked is there's a lift fan inside the vehicle. So basically the engine's driving to the propeller in the back and a lift fan inside. The lift fan in itself caused a little bit of problems. And the fact is, if you kind of look right here, that's the air intake, and the lift fan is basically located down here. They had an incident in November 1968 when the Army had their 3 down in the Delta. They had an ARVN soldier actually fall into the lift fan on an operation. It was not pleasant, basically shut the vehicle down, but the key to it was that's where, and again, ingenuity in the field, not a good design feature, having that chance of somebody falling in. And what you'll see later on, and it's right here, they basically built a screen mechanism to try to make that not happen again. Now, one of the interesting things I had when I interviewed the people in the unit was the fact that all the official records had said that the individual fell into the lift fan. He had gotten up, helmet got loose, he went to grab his gear as it was falling, you know, it was going away from him, and that's what caused it. However, when I was doing the interviews with the soldiers in the unit, one of the soldiers in particular kind of pulled me aside when he first met me. He said, "Sir, I really got to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay." He says, "Yeah, I got a problem with the article that I had originally written." And what was interesting about it was I go through and I'm interviewing the individuals in a hotel room, and I, for once, let other individuals in the unit in the room while I was doing an interview with a person. Well, I get through the whole interview, and he hasn't brought up anything. So, of course, the last question you ask is there anything I have not brought up that you would like to talk about? And he talked about it. And besides it being very emotional to him this many years later, and this happened last August, he said that the individual did not fall in. The individual was actually shot. And that's what propelled him back into the engine. So that's one of the things right now on my agenda. I'm doing more research on exactly what happened in that day in November. Basically, I won't get into it, but the aerodynamics and all the physics of it, they ran off a bag and finger skirt system in the vehicle, which for the most part worked well. Only drawback to an ACV, it can go up a hill, but it can only go up so much of a hill. And that's where, you know, and you'll see later on where they did their operations, where this came into play. Basically, once they hit a certain degree, obviously when you think of anything running on top of air, you're going to lose momentum unless you got enough power to actually get you over it. A couple other things that play into effect. So again, that's the biggest issue with the designs for air cushion vehicles, especially for combat operations. Not good on hills. And you'll see that come up a number of times. Basically, the crew consisted of a commander, usually sat on the left side. You'll see the positions here a little bit later. You had a driver, a center gunner, 2 ring gunners up on top, and two door gunners. So it was a fairly heavily armored vehicle. And even though you can't really see it well there, because it kind of came from a Navy background, even the Army vehicles were equipped with a Deca radar. Basically at a 25 range, they could see what was around them for about 24 miles. And one thing to look at, and I'll show you when I get a picture where you can see the radar dish. Watch as some of these photographs go on, because in some of the photographs you can see the dish, and other ones you don't. At some point, about 1969, the crews decided to pull off the radars because it wasn't as effective as they initially had used it for navigation. For where they were operating, they actually pulled it off. So that's one feature that actually went away in the process. On the right side, you had the driver. And basically, it was very helicopter-like. Same type controls, a lot of the same type things that you would see in the helicopter. So not much difference there. There's your front gunner, the forward gunner. Normally, it had a 50 cal machine gun, which if you get up close and you can see it, you got a 50 cal that's up front, MAUDUs. Up on top, you had two gunner positions. One mounting MAUDUs 50 cal, the other a GAU 7.62 minigun. Here's the view from the 50 cal station. And here is the minigun. Minigun was not originally equipped on the vehicle. That's one of the modifications they basically did in field, in country. Originally it was 250 calibers up on top. And then you have your M60 7.62 millimeter door machine guns, one on each side. Now, this is actually a 20 millimeter gun that they put out of the forward gunner station. Now, the story behind it is because they were looking for a lot of different things to do with the vehicles to up the armament. And you'll see when they first got stationed there, they were co-located with the Navy ACVs, the PACVs, on their second deployment. One of the things they found after the Navy unit moved up to Military Region 1, they found that in one of the connexes somewhere, a 20 millimeter gun, not necessary for the PACVs. They worked on it, modified it, put it on the craft, took it out to test it. It didn't work out too well, so most of the time you're going to see 50 cals up front. They also went with twin 50 cals up on top. The theory originally was both stations would have twin 50 cals. And they had lower M60s twin down in the forward position. That too was discarded. Basically what you'd see in the 50 cal up front and then the 50 cal in the minigun up on top was the standard armament. The other interesting one, this is the only photograph that I know that exists of it, they actually went out and mounted the M60s not in the actual doors, but up on the platforms next to the doors where the gunners would sit outside. They gave them a little bit of protection, armor, protection for strap-on, and that was it. That also did not last very long. Took it out for some tests, and it didn't work out well. They tended to run with the people sniffer in the vehicle, just like off the helicopters that were operated in theater. The next thing we're going to talk about is the genesis of it, the platoon, and the working partners that it tended to work with. So some of these you should know. But the actual first ACV combat was the British, because again, this was originally their design. They took some of theirs and went down to an operation about 900 miles southeast of Vietnam, in Borneo in 1965. Raise your hands if you even know about the Borneo combat that the British went through. Okay, With that, they also had the Australians. So if you were around the Australians in Vietnam, a lot of their service members had actually already fought in Borneo. And this was between Indonesia and Malaysia as Malaysia stood up. And so they took 2 of their ACVs, used them basically for transportation on the rivers, and it worked out fairly well. What's important to the American side is, after they ran this test, and it was basically small unit tactics. It was companies, platoons, special operations on the British side. They would go across the border into the Indonesian area, do their combat, and pull back out. As a side point, if you're ever interested in the background for the domino theory, this is one of those cases where the United States really did not support its allies that well in the whole Indonesian, Malaysian situation. Basically, they were not too worried about anybody losing down there. So that was interesting. But the benefit to the American side was the ACVs were taken up to Thailand after they'd done with their operations in Borneo. And they actually went to the joint Thai-U.S. Military Research and Development Center in Bangkok. And again, this is one of those units on the United States side and most people don't know about. That is actually like the DARPA, or at the time it was ARPA, where they tested a lot of the theories and weapons or systems that they ended up using in Vietnam. The British took their 2 ACVs up there, and it was the first time the Army really got to see the vehicles up close, ran through some operations, and basically got good reports back from the Army side. The second background to how the Army got its ACVs is the Navy. And here what we're seeing is the PACV operations. The Navy, shortly after the British experience, had gotten 3 of the vehicles very close to the British, not really modified on basic lessons learned. They took them, trained them up in San Diego, took them over. Obviously, here you see an LSD. That's how they dropped them off. So they were completely up, assembled, took them in the country. They were at Cat Low. And their basic premise from the Navy side point of view was they were not going to use it in the Delta per se. They were going to use it mainly on the river. So that's, you're talking game warden or market time on the coastal areas. The riverine type mission was like a last second, Special Forces on the Army side is asking us to go do some operations because the Delta had flooded in 1966, making operations extremely difficult for both sides. So what basically happened was they went in there, and this is actually one of the Navy PACVs. And what I want you to pay attention to is look at the decks on the side. They're rolling, they're sloped. There's only, even though it's hard to see because of the light, there's actually only 1 gunner station up on top. But they went in and they combined it with airboats, this was the first time the airboats had been really used a lot. They had a very successful mission. Basically, they were near the Cambodian border. They brought the PACVs in, the airboats in, were able to corner a VC unit that had been inside country, used air mobile to come around them as the PACVs and the airboats basically engaged them, put the helicopters between them and the Cambodian border. Was extremely successful. So this built up the momentum even more for the Army to go ahead and get get ACVs. And we get to the Army part of this. Now, I saw in the bio for the new member that somebody had served in the 77th Armor up in Military Region 1. Is that individual here by chance? Okay, well, the person that's really responsible in the Pentagon was an action officer, a project officer by the name of Colonel Mila. Now, if any of you served on M551 Sheridans, he was the project officer for that. He was the project officer for ACVs. And basically, he got the good reports in from Thailand. Also, he got a request from MACV. It's called an insure, which is basically what they did in the recent conflicts, where there was a procedure to go ahead, get equipment without all the normal testing that's done in the United States to accept a piece of equipment into the system. They got a PACV request for ACVs. He's the one that dealt with it. Now, what do you think the issue was? He now has this mission to do, and nobody has a clue as to what these vehicles are, how they're supposed to operate. So he was given free rein. And when he did that, he went ahead and he picked an individual, and we'll talk about in a moment about the commanders. And between the two of them, basically did everything to get the system up and running. From what modifications were going to be made to the Navy of the British models and what was going to happen in theater. The unit started up in February '68 up at Aberdeen. That's where it went through its training. It's trained up to go into theater. And basically, even though it's hard to see here, there's basically only a couple sections to this platoon. There's a headquarters, an assault section, and there was 2 type vehicles. Even though there's 3, 2 of them were basically what you would call a gunship, and 1 was purely a transport vehicle. They were armed almost the same, except for the fact that the transport did not have, and I'll show it to you in a minute, the M5 40mm grenade launcher on it. It's the only way you could tell the difference between the 2 vehicles. They were all used the same in theater. But what was unique about this was the fact that this was a platoon commanded by a major. Okay, and as most of the Army personnel in here, a lot of the Marine Corps ones, if you were a platoon leader, that's the rank you were, as second lieutenant when you went into this. This was commanded by a major. Now, what's important about that is the division that this unit went to, the 9th Infantry Division, had lost its cavalry, basically lost its cavalry squadron, except for the air portion of it. The ground portion got redeployed to another military region. So this platoon, even though it's 3 vehicles, about 30-some people, basically became the cavalry ground portion to the 9th Infantry Division later on. And you'll actually see that this platoon leader, or platoon commander from the Marine Corps side of the house, actually ended up doing a lot more than you would think a normal platoon leader would do. In essence, it functioned like a separate company. Except for the fact, like all good military decisions in Washington or anywhere else, they did not give them the people or the resources to be a separate company. So now you got basically a unit, 1 officer, and then you had a maintenance warrant officer and enlisted personnel, and that was it. They were required to do a lot more missions than just what a platoon would do. Oop. Those commanders, what was, Colonel Mila ended up having to pick the first commander. And what he did, and it worked out for the first 2 commanders, were both individuals that had already served in Vietnam. They served in the 173rd Airborne. And as a matter of fact, Major Moore, the first commander, was the commander of Company D, 16th Armor, which was the 173rd Armor Platoon, or Armor Company. And he got the Silver Star for Valor during that deployment. He was the first commander. And Major Zeman, who was the second commander, was a friend of Moore, both in the 173rd and at Fort Knox, and helped Moore unofficially stand up the unit, pick all the personnel, the enlisted personnel that were going into the unit. He was supposed to go to PACV staff when he went into country. He said, hey, I'm familiar with this unit, I'd like to be its second commander. And lo and behold, the correct decision was made. Once he got into country, magically orders showed up, the 9th Infantry Division Jeep showed up, he got his orders, and he got to go take command from his friend, again, who had brought the unit into country. The unit was all volunteers. Everybody got interviewed to go into the unit. Nobody was forced to go into the unit, including on the officer side. Deployment was in May 1968, and for those that can remember that, there's your C-133s. That's what took the unit into Vietnam. Now, the reason why I bring that up is a little bit different than the Navy. Navies went on the LSDs, they were ready to go. That ramp dropped down, the PACVs went off, and they were ready to do it. When the Air Force brought them in, just like when a C-133 would take in a CH-54 helicopter, you had to pull the pieces out, reassemble it. They ended up having to lift them by CH-54s into the river past one of the bridges, and then they deployed down to their area of operations. This is basically military region 4, a little bit of 3. This was the area in which they operated in. Don't get too wrapped up about this one because I understand it's, you know, I did this off 250,000 maps to get you basically the layout of it. Here's a closer mark of where they operated. Basically the 2 areas they succeeded the most in was up in the plain of reeds, because again, it suited the capabilities of the vehicle. Second part was down at the Rungsat Special Zone, which I'll tell you, they did. I did not know when I wrote the article the first time about this mission. The second commander, Major Zeman, told me about it. Pretty spectacular. First base was Dong Tam. And what's interesting was, when they went in, the Navy had pulled their PACVs out of Vietnam, modified them, retrained up a new group, and sent them back in the country. So, interestingly, they got there in December of '67, left out in June of '68, moved up to Region 1. But for a while, they existed on the same base with the Army ACVs. Now, I, not having served with the unit, wondered how well did that work out? It did not work out really well. There's a lot of difference between the 2 philosophies of how the units ran. On the Navy side, they were almost all officer crews, except for some of the gunners. They treated it truly like a ship and a boat, and they tended to focus on the river side of it or on the coastal side of it. The Army had gone actually the opposite way, and they had looked at it and said, you know what, don't need an officer actually piloting the boat, we're going to let the enlisted do it. So they got the Cavalry scouts, primarily that's what made up the crews. They went ahead and manned them and then operated them. But other than that, no joint operations, which actually surprised me based on how few numbers they had. Having 6 in country would have been, or on an operation would have been better than 3. When they were there, they were obviously co-located with the 9th Infantry Division. And as I said, the 9th no longer had its ground cavalry, so this unit ended up constituting it. The commander was given pretty much free rein because, again, nobody knew how to really use them. So he was allowed not only to do the missions the division wanted to do, but if he could come up with anything on his own, he could go ahead and execute it. And for those that weren't in the 9th Infantry Division, originally 9th Infantry Division had 1 brigade to the Riverine Force. They eventually had 2 brigades that were committed to it, and then when the division pulled out, and it was the first division to leave Vietnam, it left back 1 brigade, that was 3rd Brigade, that was separate, and they basically took over that mission completely. Their second base was Ben Luck, the Navy base, and here you actually see, for an Army unit, this was pretty nice. They lived off a barge. And they basically split it into 2 levels, but this is where the enlisted men slept and stayed. And then here we're going to talk about some of the combat concepts. This picture is actually pretty rare. You see all 3 ACVs in the field at one time. That was not normal. Normally what it was 2 vehicles out, 1 vehicle back for maintenance, and they would rotate it. So it's very seldom they'd actually be able to take all 3 out at the same time. Why is that important? You only have 3 of them. It's supported by contractors. You didn't have a lot. So if something broke, sometimes it had to go all the way back to England to get a repair part out of it. They cut a deal with the Marine Corps up at Marble Mountain. They started rebuilding their engines for them, cut down turnaround time from like 120 days to 30 days. So that worked out extremely well for them. Command and control, even though they had no helicopters organic to themselves, what they tended to do was they would get a helicopter from the division. ACV platoon, the platoon leader would tend normally to be in the helicopter. Obviously, they operated with riverine forces. There you see some of the riverine forces behind them. They worked with the Seawolves, the Navy UH-1 squadron that was there. With Val 4, which was the OV-10 Navy squadron. And a lot of times they operated with the 334th, the first Cobra unit in country. This happens to be out of Playboys, the Gunship platoon. They worked with 17 Special Operations Squadron, as AC-119Gs, which were dedicated to troops in contact. Had a lot of operations with them. Motor recovery when they broke down the field, CH-54s.
Yeah, that was Max in that cockpit, right? Yeah, thank you, Max.
Motor recovery when the CH-54s weren't around. Manpower. It actually worked out well because, again, it's riding on air. So once you got the momentum going a little bit, you pretty could much move that with a few guys. They recovered them in the field that way a lot of times. But about 6 soldiers, because they were carrying them on the decks, the infantry that they were supporting, carrying them on the decks, have 6 guys jump into the mud and the water, give them a rope, and they could pretty much get over any obstacle they needed to get over. So fairly easy to move. Real quick, we'll go over the platoon's missions and results. Combat operations, like anybody, they would head out of the base. And right there's a good example where you see the troops on the deck. So they usually carry up to 6 on each side. And that was an interesting fact. When we get to the end, you'll see what the advantages were for actually carrying them on the side decks versus inside where they originally were supposed to be. They would operate in the river canals. They would go ahead and do searches just like the Navy would when they were on the rivers. And these are actual photographs off the ACVs. But their specialty was the planer reeds. There, it was in its optimum operating environment. They would do sweeps, and again, you see the troops up on the deck. Whenever they would put the troops off, and the troops would go through, let's say, a village or huts that were at any given location, the ACVs would do overwatch, and there you see the M5 grenade launcher on the left side of basically the attack version of the ACVs. Here's an example of the troops. These are out of the 4th Battalion, 47th Infantry. To get a feel for the kind of operating environment in which they were in. And there they are coming back after a sweep. And when you collapse the air cushion, they were fairly low. It was a fairly good deal. A lot of the troops complained that worked with them is a big target. Well, that was usually when they were up on their back, but there was a couple things that kind of helped them out in that situation. Because one, they started shifting to night operations. Again, another shot, them getting back on board. And what they finally did was they would try to train up one company in each battalion to work with these guys. So if they were going to go out on a mission, they try to reutilize the same troops that were used to working with them, just to cut down. There was always a little bit of a learning curve. They try to cut down on it. And again, even getting the guys back on the vehicle sometimes are hard. As you see here, they're trying to pull one of the soldiers basically sunk down to his waist in the mud, back onto the vehicle. They did a lot of we talked about the Riverine Force. They did a lot of operations with Rangers, SEALs, and the Special Forces. This happens to be Company M, 75th Ranger, which happened to be the 9th Infantry Division's Ranger Company. They took and transported a lot of prisoners. And they would find a lot of supplies for the VC side, because again, their whole purpose in life, 9th Infantry Division, was stop enemy forces coming in from the Parrots Beak. So they had a lot of success in that, working with those other team members. And they would go back to the base. Now the next part, this is where being a major kind of worked for the Army. This is a fire support base, Gettysburg. Anybody heard of that fire support base? It was right on the Cambodian border. I mean, it was like 2 miles off of it. And on those maps, if you want to see them later on, I can bring the maps up. It was pretty close. It was commanded by the platoon leader for this platoon. They gave him the base, they set it up, and that's where they operated from. On the Navy side, they were an active participant in giant slingshot and duffel bag. That was the 2 rivers coming out of the Parrots Beak, where the Navy did their interdiction on the rivers. And it would also help set up all the sensing devices on the river to try to give warning for the U.S. forces that went in. Of course, and for all you that had the experience with it, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. A lot of times they would react to it and not be able to find anything out where they had gone out to do the inspection. Now, Nabi was their training site in country. They tended to do driver's training because you got to remember, there's 3 of them. Units already deployed out of the States, there's no training in the United States. So what would have to happen is the unit would pull off, the ACVs would go up to the Navy base, do the training up there. But Rungsat is what's really unique and interesting about this. When I was talking to the second commander, he says, well, I don't know if you've heard about this, but we worked with the CIA with Project Phoenix for a while, for a couple of weeks, and the Vietnamese PRU unit that was up in Rungsat, and we actually went in and rescued prisoners of the VC. They were South Vietnamese nationals that they held in a prison camp. Now, for me, I hadn't heard many times where we actually were able to rescue anybody from any kind of prison camp on any of the sides. They went in and they actually rescued 12. The PRU had gotten the intelligence. They went in and actually rescued them. He thought I wasn't going to be able to find a lot of information on it, but when I was up at the National Archives, pulled the 9th Infantry Division records, almost the first report I came upon was his after-action report of that operation. So that ended up being very simple. They ended up losing 2 of the 3 boats, and this basically all happened in 1970. This is there was 901, 902, 903. 901 was both taken out by mines, and 901 was the first one to go. It was up by fire support base Gettysburg. Basically, it went over it, and here's where the story about carrying the soldiers on the decks worked out in the favor of the U.S. In both this and the loss of 902, which happened in August of 1970, all the individuals that were on the deck lived and had almost no injuries at it. Why? Because what it did, since it was riding on a cushion air, it just pushed the vehicle up. Everybody got just basically propelled off of the vehicle that were on the decks and were able to pretty much walk away from it. But when you have 3 vehicles and you lose 1, then you lose 2, you pretty much become combat ineffective after that point. The more tragic one, and nobody was killed on that ACV when it went down. Here's the loss of 902. And when I did my research originally, I was trying to find a veteran from the unit. Couldn't find one. Got a hold of the Mobile Riverine Association. It had just stood up. And the individuals, the president at the time, yeah, I'm sure we got a lot of guys from the unit. Comes back and says, I found one guy, Jack Keaveney. He says, I'll contact him, see if he wants to work with you. Of course, Jack got a hold of me. He said he was more than thrilled. He had left the country after the war was over because he was on this vehicle. 3 individuals were killed on it, and he was severely wounded. And the other door gunner inside actually had gotten severely injured on the vehicle. So you lost 2, and basically for the last month of their combat operations, they were down to 1. They actually had a lieutenant now commanding the unit, and they basically shut down in country in August of 70. Conclusion to this, here's a quote from Colonel Hackworth, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the name. He was the commander of the 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry, down in region, Military Region 4. He said 2 ACVs can do more in a couple of hours than I can do with a battalion, do all day with a battalion. So that's a pretty good compliment to the system. And that's really, other than the, and again, there's the 3 that were killed in action, August 3rd, 1970. This is what it really comes down to. At the surface, it looked like this was not a good experiment. Actually, the unit loved them. All the reports loved the capabilities of the vehicle. And as early as August of 1968, the PACV had a request in for 12 additional ACVs, so they basically bring it up to company level. What affected not getting the 12 was basically timing. The unit got into country after Tet. There was already the movement to withdraw forces from Vietnam. And Colonel Mila, who had been the original project officer, had deployed and had been a battalion commander of the 77th Armor up in Military Region 1. He came back to the Pentagon, he got the job again. So he had the request there. The bottom line was 9th ID was pulling out of the division. There was no sense to actually go ahead and purchase the vehicle. So that in conclusion is the 39th and its role in Vietnam. Subject to your questions if you have any.
All right, what I'd like to do, if any of you have questions, Kevin will be here for a few minutes. I'd like to have you come up and talk to him personally. I want to thank you very much. I do have two quick questions. Being a Cavalry, was this a black hat Stetson unit or what color Stetsons did they wear?
They actually had none.
Oh,
and the reason why, again, I told you it went under a lot of names. It was originally referred to just as an armor unit.
I see.
70 is when they really got the Cav moniker, so no, they didn't.
All right, and I'm assuming none of these exist in museums anywhere.
Actually, there is one. 903, the transport version, is up at Fort Eustis. Yeah, they found it after some other Army testing when they brought it back to the States. That's where you can see it. There's also one of the PACVs up in Bellingham, Washington.
Kevin, thank you very much. And on behalf of us,